talk this morning about the power of the cross, and this is something that I think sometimes is difficult for us because we weren't there at that moment. And so it really takes some effort for us to get ready for that. I want you to look with me in the book of Isaiah, the 46th chapter, beginning in verse 8, where Jehovah is talking to his people. So Isaiah 46, verse 8. Is something wrong? Oh, that's not going to show up there. So I couldn't get the switch to happen. That's why you didn't see it. I'm a dork. The image of the cross that Sean had done was like on the crossbars. He had put biceps on the crossbars going up like this. It was ridiculous. Thank you for trying to explain that to me, Earl. It took too long for that. If any of you want to be horrified later, I can show you that image. All right. Isaiah 46, beginning in verse 8. God is talking about himself, that there's no other gods like him. He's making a contrast, actually, in this passage with the gods of Babylon. But the application goes way beyond just that. Isaiah 46 and in verse 8. Remember this and stand firm. Recall it to mind, you transgressors. Remember the former things of old, that I am God and there is no other God. I am God and there is no God like me. Declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times, things not yet done. Saying, my counsel shall stand, I will accomplish all my purpose. Calling a bird of prey from the east, the man of my counsel from a far country. I have spoken, I will bring it to pass. I have purposed, I will do it. So notice that, at least in part in this passage, God's proof for himself, the proof that he offers, is that he has a purpose and that he declares what that purpose is. The purpose that he's talking about here is vast in scope, isn't it? From ancient times, things not yet done, right? I can tell you from the beginning what's the end. That's really incredible to me. Notice the language that he has used with regard to that. Declaring the beginnings from the end. I will accomplish my purpose. That's the plan. I'm a man of counsel. That my counsel shall stand. I will accomplish all my purpose. Over and over in these verses, he's made it clear, I know what I want to happen. And then the next thing that he does is he tells us that he's going to do it. The second aspect that proves his deity is the power to do it. Not just that he makes plans. Any of us can make plans, right? Any of us can say, this is what I'm going to do. What's the problem with our plans? Sometimes the problem with our plans, just to go with what you were saying earlier, is that we get up in the morning, we go out to go to work, and the car doesn't start. Stupid car. You know, why didn't it? We have a plan, we have a purpose. I'm trying to get to work, but I can't fulfill it. God is different, because when he determines what his purpose is, he has the power to make it happen. Now, I want you to note in this passage, he doesn't just say that I see something's going to happen in the future. He doesn't say that. He didn't just see the future. He decided what was going to happen, and then he makes it happen. I will accomplish my purpose. None of us can say that. No other God can say that. I will bring things about in these things. Not only does he declare the things, but he says, my counsel shall stand. I'm going to do it. I have purposed it. This is the end of verse 11. I have purposed it, and I will do it. So this passage emphasizes Jehovah's uniqueness. His wisdom is emphasized in making a plan and a purpose that spans all of time, and his power in making things happen. That's why often in the Old Testament, he's called the Almighty. There's no one like him. He is almighty. That uniqueness is important for us to understand. Now, I want you to look with me at verses 12 and 13, because I don't think I read those. And the point that he makes is here. Listen to me, you stubborn of heart, you who are far from righteousness. I bring my righteousness, it is not far off, and my salvation will not delay. I will put salvation in Zion for Israel, my glory. What is his plan? Did you notice the words that he uses here? My righteousness, my salvation, and my glory. He has a plan for righteousness, salvation, and glory, and we're a recipient of that. And this is where the power of the cross comes in. 1 Corinthians 1 and in verse 17. For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not with words of eloquent wisdom, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power. The cross of Christ is a powerful message. And Paul says, essentially, I'm not going to mess with that. I need to make sure everyone understands that. It is interesting to me that of all people, Paul would talk about the power of the cross. He was of an age that he may have witnessed the crucifixion. And if he hadn't witnessed it, being who he was and where he was among the Jews, I have no doubt that he heard about it. And he persecuted those who had followed him. Think for a moment about what Peter talks about in Acts, the 2nd chapter. In Acts, the 2nd chapter, on that day of Pentecost, when Peter is talking about the things that happened on that day, we see the fulfillment, I think, in part of Isaiah in this passage. Acts, the 2nd chapter, and we're looking at verses 22 and 23. Peter says, Men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with mighty works and wonders and signs that God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves know. So what is part of Peter's appeal to them concerning knowing Jesus Christ? God bore witness. And what was the witness? All those miracles, right, that he had done. And there's so many. We could talk about them, but all those miracles were there. He says, and you know it. I've always thought that's interesting. As you know, these things happened. Now go on to verse 23. This Jesus, delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. Not only was this known, who he was, but you went ahead and crucified this one. While Jesus walked this earth, God was constantly proving to the Jews and to the Gentiles that he's the Messiah, that they should listen to his words, that he is the Savior of Israel and he's the Savior of the world. In fact, that's what Hebrews, the 2nd chapter, also talks about. While talking about our great salvation, while God also bore witness with signs and wonders and miracles, those demonstrations of power, God giving witness of who Jesus is, I don't think they ended when Jesus went to the cross. I think they were prominent when Jesus went to the cross. They intensified in a way that could not be ignored. God saying to the world, when Jesus is even dying on the cross, note this moment. This is what's happening. And that's important because, as Paul says later in 1 Corinthians, the 1st chapter and verse 22, since the Jews demand signs, it's really important that God would do that. Do we think that Jehovah would not provide witness even as Jesus is accomplishing God's purpose? God powerfully bore witness to what's happening on the cross. That this was a part of God's definite plan and foreknowledge that he had talked about. Jehovah wanted it to be clear what was happening exactly that day. And so in Matthew the 27th chapter and verse 46, we're told that about the 9th hour, while Jesus was on the cross, he cried out with a loud voice, my God, why have you forsaken me?" So many times the question's been asked, why would Jesus say that when he was dying on the cross? As we noted a couple of weeks ago, even as Jesus said those words, some of the people at that point mocked him. Oh, he's crying for Elijah. He wants Elijah to come to prove that he's the Messiah. It was an opportunity for them to dismiss him and to reject him. But what I think Jesus is doing at this moment is that he is pointing to a prophecy of the events of this day. Because my God, why have you forsaken me?" is the first line of Psalm 22. And Psalm 22 provides astonishing details about the suffering of Jesus that would happen on the cross. And I need you to turn there with me to Psalm 22, because most of the lesson is going to be looking at those things. The psalm deserves to be read as a whole. Actually, it deserves to be read as a whole and then go and read about the death of Christ in the Gospels. It helps to bring them together. Maybe later today you'll have time to do something like that. But here are a few of those things. And I think this is what Jesus is doing when he cries, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Jews who know this passage, who have sung this psalm, would think about these things. My God, why have you forsaken me?" Of course, that's the obvious first one, isn't it, from Psalm 22? My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me from the words of my groaning? I want you to understand, I know that when this psalm was written, it was written by David, by something David was going through. And it very much applies to David. But there are very clear indications that he's also looking forward to what's happening with Jesus. Those are the things that Peter talked about that angels wanted to know, that it was hard to understand. So a lot of people, when we read, my God, why have you forsaken me?" say that this expresses the anguish of Jesus, that as he's on the cross, that he's dying, he feels abandoned by Jehovah, by his Father, by his God. I disagree with that. And I disagree with it, and I don't know why my slides are not progressing, not that you can see it, but I disagree for two reasons. I think this cry served a purpose. Why would God abandon his son at that crucial moment when Jesus is giving himself in full obedience, in full sacrifice, to do exactly what they had planned? I don't think God would abandon him at that point. In fact, what we see through the scriptures over and over again is when God does speak on behalf of his son, what does he say? When Jesus was baptized to fulfill all righteousness, what did God say from heaven? "This is my beloved son, with whom I am well pleased." And when he was at the transfiguration and Moses and Elijah were there together with him, he said, "This is my beloved son, with whom I am well pleased." As Jesus prepares for the cross, he prays to the Father about the things that he's about to go through, and he says to his Father, "Father, glorify your name." The voice came from heaven and said, "I have glorified it, and I will glorify it." This is a glorious thing. There would be no more touching of a moment for a father when his son has given his all in love to save everyone. I believe even at this moment, the Father is pleased with Jesus. And so I reject that idea that he's saying he's been abandoned by God. what I think this passage is doing is saying to the people that they should turn their attention to what was happening and think about it more deeply. Remember in our last lesson, we talked about the fact that the people had gathered because it was a spectacle. That's why there was mocking and jeering and there was cruelness to Jesus while he was on the cross. They're there for a show. And what they need to realize is it's not a show. That something wonderful, tragic but wonderful, is happening at this time. And this cry was to turn their mind to this psalm. And I think sometimes even we forget to do that. I think sometimes we forget to go back and say, this is what God said would happen, and this is what happened. So we need to do things like that. So notice in verses 4 and 5, Psalm 22, verses 4 and 5. In you our fathers trusted, they trusted and you delivered them. To you they cried and were rescued. In you they were trusted and were not put to shame. So here we have that idea of trust. And that's one of the mocking things that was said to Jesus on that day in Matthew 27 and verse 43. They said, he trusts in God, let God deliver him now if he desires him, for he said, I am the Son of God. And I know it's not exactly parallel. The concept is clearly there. Those who were mocking Jesus said that in derision. There is Jesus against his will on the cross. That's what most of the people saw. Not only is it against his will, but he's nailed to the cross. And they uttered that cry, he trusts in God, thinking that God would not deliver him. After all, here is Jesus dying on the cross as a criminal, with other criminals. Thinking that this proved that Jesus' claim that he's the Son of God couldn't be true because he can't deliver himself. Thinking that dying on the cross is a shameful death. They cried those things out. But when David uttered those words, what was he thinking about? It was an expression of his faith, wasn't it? God delivers his people. God is worthy of believing in, therefore. And also understanding, especially in the last part of verse 5, that Jesus didn't die in shame, but he died in glory. And in doing that, Jesus does, in fact, show his complete trust in God as he's dying on the cross. And that's what Peter made the point of in 1 Peter, the 2nd chapter, verses 22 and 23. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile again. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. He continued entrusting himself to, as Jesus was dying on the cross and they're taunting him, he trusts in God, let God save him. In fact, Jesus is, by staying on the cross, trusting in God completely. It's kind of ironic. But that's a beautiful thought, isn't it? Verse 6 in Psalm 22. But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by mankind and despised by the people. Matthew 27, verses 30 and 31 tells us that they spit on him. They took a reed and they struck him with it on the head. They mocked him. They stripped him of his clothing and they put on a garment that was intended to mock. And they led him off to be crucified. We see a similarity there, don't we? He was treated not as a man, but as something less than a man. He was despised by the people. And yet he was continuing to trust himself to the one who judges justly. In verse 7, all who see me mock me. They make mouths at me. They wag their heads. We're told in Matthew 27 and verse 39 that all those who passed by Jesus derided him, wagging their heads. There are some people who have said that this only matches because Matthew knew Psalm 22 and he made sure that it worked out. Be careful, because you're forgetting that God said, I'm the one that makes the plan, and I make it happen. And he had made this situation where the reaction of the people would be that they would be wagging their heads in derision of Jesus. And there is Jesus dying on the cross, and they're mocking him and wagging their heads, and yet he continued to entrust himself to the one who judges justly. Verse 8. He trusts in the Lord. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, for he delights in him. What a cruel thing to say. And yet, Luke, the 23rd chapter, verse 35, these are the words. He saved others. He cannot save himself. If he's the Christ of God, he's the chosen one. And yet he continued to entrust himself to the one who judges justly. Verse 14, he says this, I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax, it is melted within my breast. In John, the 19th chapter, we're told that one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and there came out blood and water. We're more familiar with that because we think of Isaiah 53. In fact, for most of us, when we think of the prophecies of Jesus at his death, we think of Isaiah 53. That's one of the reasons I'm taking us to Psalm 22, because I think we need that reminder. But Psalm 53 and verse 5 says, he was pierced for our transgressions. Right? It speaks of it in that same language. Notice in verse 16, for dogs encompass me. A company of evildoers encircles me. They have pierced my hands and feet. So when you think about what Jesus went through, who was he surrounded by? Matthew, the 27th chapter, verse 35, tells us about the Roman soldiers. Why were they there? Were they believers in Jesus? They were there to do a job, weren't they? And in their estimation, what were they doing? They were crucifying 3 criminals. It wasn't their job to think about it. It was just their job to do this thing. Matthew 27, verse 38. Who was crucified with Jesus? 2 robbers. Matthew 27, verse 39. Who else is Jesus surrounded by? Those who pass by. They're watching Jesus. They're watching the events. He's surrounded by these. Matthew 27, verses 41 says that the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders were all there. How many crucifixions do you think that the chief priests made a point of going to those? How many times do you think they showed up at those punishments? Maybe they also went sometimes for the show. But this time, this was different, wasn't it? They were not there just to see a spectacle. They were there because they envied Jesus. They were waiting for him to die, surrounded by dogs. Verse 16 also says, they have pierced my hands and my feet. We're told in Matthew 27 and verse 35 that we're just told that they crucified him, and it doesn't say anything about how they did it. It's actually later in the book of John where we see that fulfillment because of Thomas. The other disciples told Thomas, we've seen the Lord, because he had appeared to them. Thomas had been gone. And what is it that Thomas said? Unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails, and place my finger in the mark of the nails, and place my hand in his side, I will never believe. That passage tells us they pierced him. They understood. That's what Thomas wanted to see, to believe that Jesus really was raised from the dead. Those things happened. Verse 22, Verse 18. 22, verse 18. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. One of the things I like about this one is just the specifics that go with it. Matthew 27, verse 35, we read the fulfillment. When they had crucified him, they divided his garments among them and cast lots. Now remember, what's interesting about that, we read it earlier, that before they took Jesus to the cross, they took his clothes off and clothed him in other garments. That means they had to take his regular clothes, I don't know how to say it, and they took them to the cross with him. I find that odd. I find it odd that they would look at his clothing and say, this is worth keeping. That his clothing was desirable. And not only was it desirable, it was so desirable that they all wanted it as one garment. And so they cast lots to figure out how the specifics of that verse, when you start to add all those things together, it's amazing that all those things happened. And I want to end with taking us to Psalm 22, verses 27 and 28. Psalm 22, verses 27 and 28. So we have all these fulfillments. Here's the conclusion that they need to notice. All the ends of the earth shall remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations shall worship before you, for kingship belongs to Jehovah. He rules over the nations. Through prophecy, Jehovah gave the Jews the sign that they needed to understand that Jesus is the Messiah, the one that was always coming along. Do you notice how he says that this is about salvation? Turn to the Lord. Come back to God. Be his child. Be his people. But he also emphasizes that it's not just about the Jews. It's for all the earth. Everyone needed to see what was happening at this moment. And what they see happening at this moment in verse 28 is kingship belongs, and he rules. What Psalm 22 points to more than anything else is that salvation that we have in him. And while Jesus is dying on the cross, he is the king. Just like the sign that Pilate had put there, that he didn't maybe intend to mean what he thought it meant. He really is the king. And so in these prophecies, what do we have? We have a way of seeing the power of the cross. 1,000 years before Jesus died, that's when the psalm was written. 1,000 years. And we see all these details. And the psalm says, this is about salvation. And this is about the king. And the great thing is now, we're a couple of thousand years further away from it, and it's still about salvation. That you can believe in Jesus Christ, and through the power of the cross and him dying on the cross, your sins and your transgressions can be forgiven, because he was willing to do that for you. And you can be his child. You can be a part of his kingdom and have the hope of eternal life. If you have that desire this morning, if you believe that Jesus is the Christ and you're ready to be his child, please come forward as we stand and sing. Because if you believe, we're ready to be baptized. Please come forward.